Hi everybody, my name is Alex, and on this channel I talk about all things knitting and crochet. In this video, I'm going to cover all of the basics that you need to know before you start knitting. Watch this video before you start knitting. Please, please, please. This is everything I wish I had known before I started knitting. I feel like this is especially valuable because I am also a beginner. So a beginner giving advice to other beginners. I was in your shoes not that long ago. I really remember what it's like to not know what I'm doing. And I really think these tips will help you in your beginner journey and just make the whole thing a lot easier and a lot more seamless and a lot more fun, which that is the most important part, is that we're all having fun. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to choose a pattern, what materials you need, different methods of knitting so that you can choose one that is most comfortable for you, making a gauge swatch, and general tips for once you're going, things that will just make it a lot easier for you to keep going and to make it to that finish line and be able to wear the thing that you're making. So if you're a beginner, watch this video before you start knitting because I really think it'll help. And if you're not a beginner, I would really appreciate it if you left your advice in the comments so that we can create this little space here on the internet for all of the amazing, wonderful advice for beginner knitters. I will of course have all of the chapters listed in the scroll bar, so if you want to jump around, please feel free to do that. To start, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on myself. I started crocheting a little over a year ago, and I just started by following YouTube tutorials. I loved my year of crochet, but then about 4 months ago, I started knitting. And I started knitting by knitting a step-by-step sweater by Florence Miller. Since then, I've knit quite a few other things, which I will insert on the screen here. And I will say in my 4 months of knitting, I have learned a lot, I've grown a lot, and I have absolutely fallen in love with knitting. Topic number one is going to be your pattern. So a pattern, when you are knitting or crocheting or sewing or making something, typically, if you want to make a design that somebody else has already produced, then you follow a pattern to do that. The most common place for knitting patterns to be found is a website called Ravelry. If you don't know what Ravelry is, I would highly encourage you to Google it, make an account, start browsing. If you want, you can browse through my Ravelry. I have all of my projects and all of my favorites listed on there for the public. So Ravelry lets you sort all of your patterns that you might want to make one day, and then it lets you keep track of all of your current projects. It also lets you keep track of all the yarn that you have. It lets you connect with other people. Ravelry is a great website. You can also find patterns on YouTube, of course. There are free tutorials for so many great projects on YouTube. And you can also find patterns on places like Etsy, in physical magazines. There's knitting and crochet magazines and stuff like that. So lots of places to get patterns. When you are starting out, I would suggest that you choose a quote unquote easy pattern. And easy can mean different things for different people. So when I was starting out, a lot of people told me that I should start by knitting scarves, that I should start by knitting a hat, that I should start by knitting something small, something in garter stitch, which garter stitch is where you knit flat and you just knit on both the right side and the wrong side, and it creates this bumpy fabric. I wasn't inspired by scarves. I knew that I would never wear a scarf. So I would strongly encourage you to choose a pattern that you are excited for and that you actually want the finished object, because your first project will most likely be frustrating at times. It'll also be really fun. I promise it'll be really fun, but it can be frustrating, and it is nice to have that little extra bit of motivation to finish it because you want the final object. The first thing that I knit was a sweater. I knit a full-on sweater, first time, right out the gate, beginner to sweater. And I followed Florence Miller's step-by-step sweater video tutorial that she has here on YouTube. I will link the video tutorial in the description. She also has a step-by-step cardigan if you want to knit a cardigan. I will say I would recommend your first project to be something that you knit in the round, which maybe I should explain that there's different construction methods. I of course won't get into all the construction methods here. You will absorb that as you go on your knitting journey. But there's two main constructions, and that is knitting in the round and knitting flat. So knitting in the round is where you use circular needles and you're just knitting stockinette, which is the typical fabric that we see. I will of course insert examples of everything that I'm talking about. When you're knitting stockinette in the round, all you have to do is knit. You do not need to do any purling. I will get into knitting and purling a little bit later when I talk about methods of knitting. Starting with a sweater that was knit in the round, a raglan that was knit in the round, was the best decision I could have made. The other construction type is knitting flat, and that is where you knit one way and then purl the other way. When you look at the right side of your project, you knit, and when you look at the wrong side of your project, you purl, and that's how you make stockinette flat. So if you're looking at a pattern and it's a bunch of flat panels that you then seam together to make a garment, I would say that that is maybe a little bit more difficult than knitting in the round. Knitting in the round can seem super scary because you're like, how do I make these tubes into things that I can fit on my body? But I promise it is not that hard once you start. And I will say this now, and I'll probably say it again later in the video. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. It is totally okay to make mistakes at every stage because you learn from your mistakes. I would recommend a pattern that, one, you're excited about the final garment or the final object because you want that thing in your life, and two, something that is in the round. If you really do want to make that scarf, then go ahead and make that scarf. That won't be in the round and that'll be perfectly great. But if you're like me and you wanted a garment, you want a tank top or a t-shirt or a hat or a sweater, I would recommend doing it in the round. I would strongly recommend that you choose something that has a video element to it. So the whole thing or the critical techniques are shown to you via video, because it's much easier to learn something when you see somebody else doing it rather than reading from a pattern. A knitting pattern or a crochet pattern or a sewing pattern is typically written out in a document and you have to read to understand what you're supposed to do. And as a beginner, I remember being super confused by all the knitting jargon, and it was very, very helpful to just be able to watch somebody do it and then copy exactly what they're doing. So I would recommend Florence's step-by-step sweater video. If you also want to knit her cardigan as your first project, that is maybe a little bit more challenging just because you have to knit it flat, but that shouldn't deter you. If you want a cardigan and not a sweater and you know that you'll wear the cardigan, then knit the cardigan. I would also recommend choosing a project that is knit on at least 5mm size needles. The size of the needle is the diameter of the needle, and it goes all the way from teeny tiny, like less than 1mm, up to pretty big, super chunky 15mm needles. I would say most sweaters that are not considered chunky probably knit on a 4 to 6mm needle. So if you are a beginner, I would recommend choosing a project that is knit somewhere on the 5mm needle range. It is small enough for you to get a usable garment out of, but it is also large enough for the project to go by pretty quickly and for you to feel like you're making really good progress. Again, I'm just going to say, Florence's step-by-step sweater video tutorial has a pattern attached to it is my #1 recommendation. If you're watching this and you're not a beginner and you've knit other things and you have other pattern recommendations for beginners, please comment them down below and I will make a whole Ravelry bundle of beginner-friendly patterns. Now let's talk about the materials that you're going to need in order to start knitting. The first thing that you're going to need is needles. I'm going to categorize the types of needles into 3 different categories. The first type of needle is what you might think of when you think of like a cartoon knitting. These are called straight needles, and these needles are used for knitting back and forth. They cannot be used for knitting in the round. So if you're knitting a scarf or you're knitting a sweater and seaming everything together, then you could use straight needles. Another type of needle are circular needles. Circular needles have 2 different categories. There are fixed circular needles and there are interchangeable circular needles. Circular needles allow you to knit in the round, so you can keep going in a spiral forever and ever and ever and ever if you want to. Circular needles that are fixed are needles that are attached to a cord and that cord does not come off. So that means that whatever size needle you're using is attached to the length of cord that you're using. Oftentimes when you're knitting something that is knit in the round, you need a couple different lengths of needles, right? If you're knitting a collar, that is a much smaller circumference than if you're knitting the body of a sweater. So knitting the collar, you need a shorter circular needle than if you're knitting the body of the sweater. This means you need to buy multiple needles if you're going to choose fixed circular needles. That also needs to be in your correct needle diameter size, which I talked about earlier. The other option for circular needles are interchangeable needles. This is my personal preference. So if you disagree with me, comment it down below. Let's talk about it because of course everybody has different preferences. My preference is to use interchangeable circular needles because interchangeable circular needles allow you to use your 5mm needle with your 40cm cord and your 5mm needle with your 80cm cord, and then also your 3mm needle with that 80cm cord. And you can mix and match your exact right needle size and cord length. Whatever you need for your project, you can create. You can buy both fixed and interchangeable circular needles by themselves. Like you could just buy the needle, just buy the cord, and attach them together like that. Or you can buy kits that have all the needles and cord lengths that are typically used in that size range. I will link the knitting needle set that I have in the description, as well as some other ones at various different price points. The reason that I recommend circular knitting needles to beginners and not straight needles is because anything that you want to knit, you can knit on circular needles. That means you can knit stuff in the round. Of course, that is a given because it's a circular knitting needle, but you can also knit flat. So I'm actually knitting a cardigan right now and it's knit flat, but I'm using circular needles. Okay, and then the last type of knitting needles are double pointed needles. And double pointed needles are often used for very small circumferences. They're used to knit socks, they're used to knit crowns of beanies, they're used to knit sleeves sometimes, and basically you just have several needles that have a tip on both ends, and you put some of the stitches on each needle, and then you have a free needle that you work around and you knit off of the other needles. That explanation was probably really bad. This is maybe a bonus tip. If you have any questions about anything, YouTube is an incredible resource. So if you just go into YouTube right now and you say double pointed needles, a bunch of videos will come up that'll show you how to use double pointed needles. So those are our 3 needle categories. We have straight needles, circular needles, and double pointed needles. For a beginner project, I would recommend knitting with circular needles, that second option. And my personal recommendation is to do circular interchangeable knitting needles because that can set you up better for your future knitting projects. However, they can be a couple more dollars than fixed circular needles. So if that is a barrier to entry for you, then just get the fixed circular needles and see if you like the hobby in the first place. That is perfectly fine. Other materials that you need, of course, you need yarn. So you need yarn that will work for your project. The pattern that you choose will tell you what yarns work for that pattern. I'm planning to make another video that explains yarn weights because that was something that took me quite a long time to figure out, like what is the difference between sport and DK and fingering and worsted and Aran and all of that. So I will make a separate video dedicated to explaining yarn and how to choose yarn. I'm still figuring that out for myself, so that'll probably be like an ongoing thing. Whatever the pattern says, choose that weight of yarn. So if it says that you need a DK weight yarn, then look for a DK weight yarn. If it says you need a fingering weight yarn, then choose a fingering weight yarn. I would not recommend a fingering weight project as your first project. Just like as a brief overview in terms of thinnest yarn to thickest yarn, lace weight, light fingering, sport weight, DK, worsted, Aran. Okay, I don't know what happened, but I didn't finish the list. So then it goes bulky, chunky, super bulky, super chunky, and jumbo. I would also urge you to not worry too much about yarn fiber in terms of yarn composition. So if a barrier to entry for you is cost, then an acrylic yarn is a great option. They are very inexpensive. A lot of acrylic yarn handles just as well as wool or alpaca or other types of natural fibers like cotton, linen, things like that. My first sweater that I knit was knit using acrylic yarn. It cost me $11 to knit the whole thing. If you want something that's a little warmer, then I would recommend an animal fiber, wool or alpaca or a wool blend of sorts. If you want something that is a more summer warm weather fiber, then cotton is great. I would recommend though for your first project to go in person to a yarn store if you have one available to you. I went to a Michael's, which is just like a big box craft store, and see and touch the yarns in person to make sure that you actually like the yarn, the softness of the yarn, the texture of the yarn, the color of the yarn. Moving on to color of yarn. For your first project, I would recommend choosing a darker colored yarn, because darker colors are going to hide your mistakes a little bit better. Lighter colors definitely show mistakes very easily. And it being your first project, you are most likely going to make mistakes. I know I made a ton of mistakes on my first project, and I knit my first sweater in a dark charcoal color, and you can't even tell. You cannot tell unless you're looking really closely. I will warn though, be careful with this, because knitting with a darker yarn, it's harder to see your stitches, a little more challenging to understand how the stitches are fitting together. So I would not recommend black, and I would not recommend anything that is too saturated and dark. However, like a darker gray, darker purple, darker pink, any color that you love, a color that you love and you wear, but make it a little bit darker. Don't choose a white or a cream for your first project, unless you want to. This is all just like my advice. You can do whatever you want to do. But yes, a darker color, it definitely served me well when I was knitting my first project. And then the last material thing that you're going to need are stitch markers. Stitch markers help you know where your beginning of round is and help you mark where you need to increase or decrease. They can help you mark the number so you can count the number of rows that you've done. Stitch markers are a really, really useful tool. When I first started crocheting, crocheting, I bought a bunch of these stitch markers, which are just the plastic safety pin type stitch markers that you see at most craft stores, and they work perfectly well for all of the things that I just mentioned. The one downside with these type of stitch markers is that they are a little bit thick. So if you're knitting with a thinner gauge yarn, they can stretch out the stitches a little bit. If you are looking for something a little bit thinner, these light bulb stitch markers are also a great option. They are also a safety pin design, so you can insert them wherever you need to insert them. I got a pack of a lot of them for pretty inexpensive. I think it was like $6 for over 100 of them. That is a great option. And then also, if you don't have any stitch markers, if you have your needles and you have your yarn, you're itching to get going right now, but you don't have any stitch markers, that is perfectly fine. You can make your own stitch markers out of yarn. And that's actually what I did for my first knitting project. I made my own stitch markers. My one recommendation for making your own stitch markers is to make them out of an acrylic yarn if possible, because acrylic doesn't disintegrate as easily as natural fibers, so it won't shed and become part of your project. It's not any fun if you're knitting something gray and your stitch marker is made out of an orange yarn and then little orange fibers get caught in your knitting as you're going. So I would recommend an acrylic yarn if you're going to make your own stitch markers. If you're going to make your own stitch markers, I would recommend using a color that is contrasting to your project. So let's say I was working with this white yarn on this project. I would choose something like this bright orange as my stitch marker so I can see it really easily. And this is an acrylic yarn, so it's not all fibery. It's not going to fall apart on me because acrylic yarn is plastic. And I'm just going to tie it into a little knot, wrapping it around my finger, pulling that loop through, and then I'm gonna tighten it, and maybe I'll do it once and then again twice, so it's super secure and it's not gonna grow or shrink. And then I'll just trim off the excess. The third category is knitting styles. So I am only going to cover Western knitting. People have been knitting around the world for centuries, and there are so many different knitting methods. And if you're curious about any other type of knitting method, I strongly encourage you to Google it. Watch some videos on YouTube. People are so knowledgeable on here. In this video, I will cover English style knitting and continental knitting. And I think for this one, I'm just gonna let Demo Me explain. Okay, so I have a little sample swatch here. This is what stockinette looks like. On one side, we have all of these V's. Here's a V, here's a V, here's a V, here's a V. And where you see the V's is called the right side. And on the other side, we have all of these bumps. Bump, bump, bump. And these are called purl bumps. And this is the wrong side. And when you're knitting stockinette, it means that you do a knit stitch when you're looking at the right side, and you do a purl stitch when you're looking at the wrong side. So like I said, there are two types of Western style knitting. There are more than just these two types of knitting in general, but I'm just gonna cover the Western style knitting. The first type is continental knitting, and this is where you hold the yarn in your left hand. Continental is really great for people who crochet, which is what I came from doing. So I started crocheting and now I knit. So I chose continental, and it works really well. It's the most comfortable for me. And the way that there are so many ways to hold your yarn. So if what I'm about to show you doesn't make sense, there are many other videos that might show you in a way that makes more sense for you. But what I do is I grab the yarn in my hand and I thread it through my first finger and my middle finger, and then I grasp it with my pinky and my ring finger, and I let it slide over my first finger like this. This is my like home position. So I grab it like this and put it over my finger. Some people don't think that that's secure enough, so people also wrap it around their pinky before putting it over their finger. Some people weave it through their fingers like that. Some people wrap it around their finger and then they hold it closer to the tip of their finger over here. But for me, what's most comfortable is to thread it through this space in between my two fingers and to grasp it with my pinky and my ring finger down here. And I'm also grasping my left needle as I'm grasping it between my pinky and my ring finger. So this is my setup position. You hold your right needle in your right hand. In order to knit, the first one is always the hardest. I like get the yarn out of the way with my middle finger. When you're looking at the knit side, when you're looking at the right side, the stitches are oriented on the needle from back to front as left to right, back to front. As you look at your knitting more and more, this will start to make more sense. So don't worry if that doesn't make any sense right now. And in order to knit, you're going to, one, make sure that your stitch is oriented the right way on the needle and that they're not twisted. So it should be going left to right, back to front, back of your needle to the front of your needle from left to right. And you're going to insert your right needle from left to right into the front leg. So this is the front leg of the stitch. This is the back leg of the stitch. So right to left into the front leg, but your right needle is going to go behind your left needle. And then you need to wrap the yarn counterclockwise around your right needle. So if we're looking at our needle straight on, it needs to wrap counterclockwise. So this direction is counterclockwise, this direction is clockwise. There are other methods of knitting in other parts of the world that don't wrap counterclockwise, but as far as I know, in Western knitting, we wrap counterclockwise. So that means we need to go around the needle like this, counterclockwise, and then you're going to pull that stitch through and take the one that you just knit off of your left needle. I'll do that again. I'll do that many more times so you can see what I'm doing. So again, left to right, wrap counterclockwise, pull that stitch through and off your needle. Left to right, counterclockwise, pull the stitch through and off your needle. The way that I wrap is I take my middle finger and I wrap it around to pull it through. As I get going a little bit faster, I sometimes don't even need to do that little bit with my middle finger. So if I really start going quickly, then I'm able to just pick the yarn. You're kind of like making a space in here and then picking the yarn from behind. So space and pick, space, pick, space, pick. I just use my middle finger to make it a little bit more secure in the back there. Space, pick, space, pick. So I'm gonna knit this whole row continental, and then I will purl a whole row continental, and then I will show you English style. So I just got to the end of my row. I'm gonna turn my work because we're knitting flat, so turn it around. And now I'm looking at the wrong side with all these bumps. And you can tell that I need to, anytime that I wanna make stockinette, I want to purl all of the stitches that have these little scarves here. So you see there's this little scarf around this stitch, scarf, scarf, scarf. And in order to purl continental, I hold the yarn exactly the same, but this time the yarn needs to start in front of your work, not behind your work. And I kind of get it out of the way with my thumb. The first one is always the trickiest. Instead of inserting your needle from left to right, like we did when we were knitting, we're going to insert our needle from right to left into our front leg. And we're still going to wrap counterclockwise. So right to left, if you're looking at the needle, you need to wrap it counterclockwise around the needle. And then you're going to pull it backwards and then pull the stitch that you just purled off your needle. So again, right to left, wrap counterclockwise and pull it off. Right to left, counterclockwise, and pull it off. I like to use I use my hand to get the yarn over, and I use my thumb to pull the yarn back. There are many, many other ways to continental purl. So if this is not making sense to you, I encourage you to go find another video that shows it a little bit differently. But that is all you need to know, knitting and purling. If you knit English style, then you're gonna hold the yarn in your right hand. Continental, we held it in our left hand. English, we're going to hold it in our right hand. And there are, again, many ways to hold the yarn. I don't knit English style, so this is going to be a subpar demonstration. But if this is more comfortable for you, there are many other videos on YouTube that show you how to knit English style. To knit English style, you're going to, again, insert your right needle from left to right. We're looking at our knit side. We see all these V's, so we're going to knit. So this is exactly the same as continental. Insert from left to right into our front leg. But because we're now holding the yarn in our right hand, we need to wrap the yarn counterclockwise. So again, if you're looking down at the needle, counterclockwise. This is clockwise. This is counterclockwise.
and then you're gonna pull that yarn through and off the needle. Insert left to right, wrap counterclockwise, pull it through and off the needle. Insert left to right, counterclockwise, and off the needle. And off, left to right, wrap around, and off, left to right, wrap around, off, all the way. Okay, when we're looking at our wrong side, so now we're looking at all these little purl bumps, we need to purl. Again, with English style, you're holding the yarn in your right hand. You're going to insert your right needle from right to left, just like I did when I was showing you continental. It's the same exact position. But the key here is that your yarn needs to be in front of your needles. So this yarn is coming out this way and it is in front of my needles. I'm going to insert from right to left. Again, wrap counterclockwise. So if we're looking down at our needle, we're wrapping counterclockwise. This is wrapping clockwise. This is wrapping counterclockwise. And you're going to pull it back and then off your needle, just like that. So right to left, counterclockwise, and off. Right to left, counterclockwise, and off.
Okay, so now you have your pattern, you have your materials, you know which style of knitting you prefer. Your next step is to make a gauge swatch. A gauge swatch is where you knit a smaller square of your project in the stitch that the pattern calls for. So if you're knitting a sweater that's a stockinette sweater, then you'll knit your swatch in stockinette using the needle size you're planning to use for the project. And the point here is to see if you have the same number of stitches in both your columns and your rows that the pattern calls for. A gauge swatch is typically measured in 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter squares or 4-inch by 4-inch squares, depending on which unit of measurement you're using. I would recommend knitting a gauge swatch that is bigger than a 10 by 10 centimeter square or a 4 by 4-inch square because your edge stitches kind of get a little wonky sometimes. So it can be more useful to knit something bigger and then measure just the center of it.
You would normally block this gauge swatch exactly how you intend to block your final garment, and blocking just means that you're going to soak it in some lukewarm water and then lay it out flat to dry, and that will also prevent, with stockinette, the edges curl really easily, so blocking will fix that. And also, do you see how some areas are a little bit bumpy? Blocking will also help with all of that. But I'm just going to show you how to measure gauge for the purposes of this video. So you take your tape measure, you set a 10 centimeter long section, and then you count the number of V's that fit in 10 centimeters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're going to count all of those. And we'll start here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sometimes it's easy to get a little lost, so I just like to use something to point so I can find myself again if I lose it. So I said 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So there are 21 stitches. And then we need to measure the row gauge too. So it's at 21, and then this one also needs to be 10 centimeters. And then we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. So 21 by 32 is the gauge of this swatch. If your gauge is more than that, like you have more stitches in your 10 centimeters, that means that your needles are too small and you need to size up. Let's say mine was 21 by 32. Let's say yours was supposed to be 21 by 32, but instead it's 25 by 36. Then you're going to size up in your needle, make your needle bigger. The other way, if your gauge is too small, so let's say your gauge was 18 by 27, then you're going to size down in your needle. So make your needle smaller. And that is how you check gauge.
Another perk of knitting a gauge swatch is that if you are a complete beginner and you've never picked up the needles before, this is a great time to practice. If you're knitting a gauge swatch and you're knitting it flat, then you're going to get to practice both knitting and purling. If you're knitting something in the round, you can also make a gauge swatch knitting in the round. Tension is very important in order to meet gauge. I know for sure for me, my gauge is very different when I'm knitting flat compared to when I'm knitting in the round. I haven't actually done this yet, but if you are up for it, knitting your gauge swatch in the round will produce more accurate results for your finished object. So now you have your pattern, you have your materials, you know which style of knitting you prefer, and you've made your gauge swatch. Now you need to start. And that's all I'll say. You just need to start. At a certain point, you can be thinking, oh, but I'm not good enough to knit a whole sweater yet. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to join in the round. I don't know how to do anything. You just need to start and figure it out as you go along. And I will say that your first project will most likely have mistakes. That is history. That is part of the garment. And you will think about the process of you knitting that every time that you wear it in the future. I know I put on my first sweater and I see all my little mistakes. I see the hole that I didn't close up on my shoulder, and I see the wonky stitches around the collar because that's where I started before I figured out how to knit with good tension. And I am transported back to the time when I was actively knitting it. It doesn't need to be perfect. The end parts of your garment will most likely be better than the beginning parts, but that's just part of the uniqueness and the story of that project. So now you have started. I guarantee you're going to run into some times where you don't know how to fix a mistake, because this happened to me. This happens to all people when they're starting to knit, and I'm going to jump into the section of the video where I show you how to do specific techniques and I show you how to fix mistakes. The first one that I think is really important is understanding the difference between a knit stitch and a purl stitch, and how to read the difference between a knit stitch and a purl stitch, so that when you get to that location, you know, okay, do I need to knit this or do I need to purl this? One of the most common examples of needing to read your stitches is when you're doing ribbing. So this is a little swatch of 1x1 rib, which means that you knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, all the way along the row. And you'll probably encounter this in your first project if you're a beginner, because ribbing is often used around collars and around cuffs and around hems, so you will most likely need to know how to do this stitch. Most useful to be able to read the stitch that you are about to knit and tell whether you need to knit it or you need to purl it. So this stitch that's on the end right here, it doesn't have a little scarf around it, those little scarves that I was talking about earlier, which means that this is a knit stitch. And when you're doing 1x1 rib, you need to just knit all of the knit stitches and purl all of the purl stitches. So this one right here doesn't have a little scarf, so I'm going to knit it. But this stitch here does have this little scarf, this little purl bump, so I'm going to purl it. And again, here, no scarf, so I'm going to knit it. Here has a scarf, so I'm going to purl it. Knit, purl, knit, purl. And because you can read your knitting, you can put this down, come back to it at any time, and be able to pick up exactly where you left off. Obviously, reading your knitting changes depending on which type of stitch you're doing, but I would say it is probably one of the most important steps in starting any project, is being able to read your stitches so that you can fix mistakes easier and so that you can understand your project better. The second technique that is really important for anything that you're knitting in the round is how to join in the round. So you cast on all your stitches. Now, how do you make it from a long snake-like thing into a circular thing? So I just finished casting on. I have cast on 100 stitches, and I'm actually going to cast on one extra stitch. I'm just using a long tail cast on. One extra stitch, so cast on one more than the number you're supposed to. And then I want to join it in the round. In order to join in the round, the first thing you want to do is to make sure all of the stitches are oriented the same way and they're not twisted. You see how the stitch is a loop that goes around the needle here, and then this has a bumpy end here. I like to make the bumpy end face into the center of the loop, but then it goes underneath and now it's twisted, so we just want to untwist all of that. Make sure it's facing in the middle. The yarn that's attached to your ball is attached to this stitch over here. And I want to connect this stitch to the stitch that doesn't have any yarn attached to it. So it has to be in this orientation. If you are like this, and you go to knit this stitch here with this yarn, then you're just going to be knitting back the way we just came, and they're not going to attach because this yarn isn't going to connect this stitch to this stitch. So it's really important that you have your needles in the right hands, that your stitches are not twisted. The yarn that's attached to the ball will always be coming from the right needle, going to knit stitches off of the left needle. I'm going to take my first stitch and I'm going to slip it purlwise, which means I'm going to insert from right to left as if to purl. I'm going to slip it onto my right needle without knitting or anything, and then I'm going to take the next stitch on my right needle and I'm going to pass it over that stitch that we just slipped. And it can be a little finicky and a little hard to do, like that. And then I'm going to tighten it up because that last stitch that we just pulled over was the last stitch that we cast on. And now we have attached in the round, and you can see we have one continuous loop all the way around. And this means that now I can just knit all the way around. If I was knitting something that was ribbed, I would start from that right here, but I am not. I'm just knitting something that's in stockinette, so I'm going to just knit all the way around. The third item that I'd like to talk about is picking up dropped stitches. So when you're starting out, it can be really scary to drop stitches. I know for me, I made a whole video documenting my process of knitting my first sweater. I dropped some stitches when I was knitting the collar, which is the first thing that you knit in a top-down sweater. I thought that I had to undo the whole thing and just start over because I didn't know how to pick up drop stitches. But it can be so useful to understand how to pick up drop stitches. And it happens all the time to everybody at every level. So knowing how to pick those stitches back up is very useful.
So imagine that you are knitting along and all of a sudden accidentally you drop this stitch off your needle and it unravels a couple rows. And now you see we have these bars here and we have the stitch down here, and how the heck do we get it all the way back up and put it back on our needle? So the first way that I'm going to show you how to fix, you don't need any extra tools, and that is to just go down to the last loop that you have intact, work its way back up. So if we look at the stitches underneath this, we see there's a loop here that goes around the loop that's on my needle, and then below that there's another loop that goes around that loop, and that loop that goes around that loop. So it's all these interconnecting loops. So we just need to keep doing that pattern. So I like to push it against the fabric, and I'm going to grab the bar that's behind it and pull it back up. And then again, put it down there, push, grab the bar. Oh, it's a little finicky, but you'll get it. Grab the bar, pull it back up. Here, grab the bar, pull it back up. And then I have successfully picked up the stitch, which is good. My yarn's coming from this stitch, which means that I haven't actually knit this stitch yet. So it actually needs to go on my left needle. And in order to tell which orientation, like I don't know whether it goes on this way or if it goes on this way. In order to tell, I like to look at other places where the same thing happens. So if we look at this next stitch, it's sitting on the needle back to front. So I'm going to do the same thing with that one. Here is the back leg, here is the front leg, and it's going this way left to right. So I'm going to stick it on like that, left to right. And now I can just keep knitting. So I'm going to keep on going. Another way that is the method that I prefer is if you accidentally drop a stitch, say we dropped it all the way to there, I like to take a crochet hook. So this is a crochet hook that I keep in my bag of knitting essentials at all times. It is a 3.75 millimeter crochet hook, but you really just need any kind of pretty small crochet hook. And you're going to go to the knit side of your work. I like to do this specifically from the knit side because it's easier to grab with the hook. And you're going to take the loop that's furthest down and put it onto your crochet hook. And then you're just gonna grab the bar that's next in line and pull it through that loop that you dropped, and then grab the next bar and pull it through, and grab the next bar, pull it through. And again, we're gonna put it back on our needle, back to front, just like that. Fixed our drop stitch.
The last tip that I will include in this video, how to change your needles when you need to increase the length of your cord. So if you're knitting something in the round, like I mentioned before, the collar is knit on a smaller circumference than the body, right? Your neck is much smaller than your waist. So you need a shorter cord, but eventually you're going to start increasing and adding more stitches to your shortened cord. And when that happens, then eventually it gets to a point where there's too many stitches on that cord for you to knit comfortably, and you need to increase the cord length. So I actually don't need to change the cord length right now, but I'm going to show you how to do it. I'm just going to change it onto the same cord length, but the process is exactly the same for if you need to change it onto a longer cord length. There's two ways that you could do this. You could either take a stopper. So the company that makes my knitting needles also makes these stoppers where you can take your right needle off of the cord and put the stopper on. And this just ensures that the stitches won't fall off there. And then you can take this needle size that you need to keep knitting your project and put it on your new longer cord. And then again, put a stopper on the other end so that the stitches don't accidentally fall off. And then all you're going to do is keep knitting from your left needle to your right needle, but this time instead of knitting around the same cord, you're just going to knit onto this new cord. If you don't have stoppers, if your set doesn't come with stoppers, then you can take another pair of interchangeable needles that's bigger than the size that you need. So right now I'm knitting on 4mm needles. These are the 4.5mm needles that come in my set. And instead of using a stopper, you just put the bigger needle on the inactive end of both cords. So getting a little confusing. There's a lot of needles here, but these two needles here are the ones that are active. And right now I'm in the process of transferring from this loop onto this loop. When I get to my beginning of round, I'm going to slip the beginning of round marker and keep going. And there we go. And now the last step is to make sure that we have the right size needle on our current working cord. Okay, oof, that was a lot of information. I hope you found at least some of this useful. If you are a beginner and you are getting into knitting, I would love it if you commented down below and let me know what you're planning to knit. I'm so excited for you on this journey. It is seriously such an incredible hobby, such a fun craft, and has such an incredible community. If you are not a beginner and you watch this whole video, thank you. I appreciate you so much. And if you have any tips for the beginners watching, please comment them, because this can just be a great space for us to get good information about knitting. If you have any other topics that you'd like me to talk about or techniques that you'd like me to cover, let me know and I can make a follow-up video. This is barely skimming the surface. If you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you let me know by giving it a thumbs up. If you liked hanging out with me, I post videos once a week about all things knitting and crochet, and I would really appreciate it if you subscribe so you get notified when I post next. If you want to see more of my projects and things that I've made, feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. I will have it linked in the description. And as always, I will have all of the information that I covered here linked in the description below so that you can find it easily. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.